This is what Hamas does. It's clearly had an objective to obliterate Israel. It wants the entire house of cards to come down. It wants conflict in the Middle East. It wants to draw other nations from across the region into a conflict.
Your thoughts on this first? I mean, British influence, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's influence is clearly limited compared to that of the United States. But what did you make of what you heard from Rishi Sunak earlier? Did you hope to hear more? And what do you want to hear now from America and other friends of Israel?
Yes, it's a one-line whip today, so a lot of parliamentarians are away, but I should say the chamber was completely full. And it started with a minute's silence in reflection of all those innocent civilians, Israel and Gaza, that have been dramatically affected by this conflict. But this was a very powerful statement by the Prime Minister, clearly condemning Hamas's terrorist activities, but also leaning into this and calling for those hostages to be released, outlining what we are doing to bolster our maritime support for the area, and also provide assistance to the Gazans, the Palestinians, who are now suffering from a humanitarian crisis. There's clearly a lot going on behind the scenes, I should stress. There's back channels taking place, but the mood of the chamber was very, very clear indeed. Total condemnation for Hamas, but genuine concern about what happens next, particularly wider escalation. And that's the point that I made. In fact, I think I was one of the only voice to call for perhaps a hesitation before there now is a ground combat full-scale invasion, given that there is not a humanitarian or security or indeed governance plan, even an emergency plan in place yet. And this might be exactly what Hamas is calling for, because they've clearly lost any right to represent the Palestinians, and they use them as cannon fodder. They're hiding behind them. So what happens in the next few days could actually have huge repercussions for where the country, indeed the region, goes in the next few years.
Right. So look, the Israeli government argument is that the innocent deaths we've seen and more to come, because more surely are to come, it's all on the head of Hamas. Innocent deaths, they argue, it's an inevitable product of war. What do you say to that?
Yes, it is a product of war. We have to recognize that this is what Hamas does. It's clearly had an objective to obliterate Israel. It wants the entire house of cards to come down. It wants conflict in the Middle East. It wants to draw other nations from across the region into a conflict. It wants the Abraham Accords to falter. And that possibly was triggered by Saudi Arabia showing an interest in legitimizing relations with Israel. And this came up again and again in the debate, the statement today. What do we do about Iran that has such proxy influence, not just in the Gaza Strip, but also in Yemen with the Houthis, for example, and indeed with Hezbollah in Lebanon and further afield as well, until the bankroller is dealt with and the weapons provider. And don't forget, there's also then another complex link with Russia. Then it's going to be very, very difficult to find any long-term solution here.
Yes. Look, if Hamas is to be wiped out, to be thrown down, as Benjamin Netanyahu and his ministers insist is the intention, what do you think could or should fill the vacuum? I mean, an Israeli occupation of Gaza, well, Joe Biden said that would be a mistake. How do you see that working?
Well, it's important that we spell that out before an invasion takes place, because otherwise what you will see is Palestinians rallying to Hamas's cause because they don't see what the alternative will be. We need to spell out that what is happening is to remove Hamas. They have lost their right to represent the Palestinians. The Palestinian people need to know that there's something to believe in, a vision for where Gaza will go.
So what could fill that vacuum?
Well, that is the thing. That's exactly what needs to be discussed now. There needs to be a temporary governance plan, a temporary security plan, and a temporary humanitarian plan. It probably will involve Fatah in the Palestinian Authority that is running the West Bank. It must involve the Abraham Accords signatories as well. They're very much involved here. And it must involve the wider international community, because only if the Palestinian people can be seen that the international community has an interest to rebuild and start the process of building those democratic foundations, then there will be no understanding of what is all this for, of what where an invasion by Israel might go to. These are the important things to be able to put a wedge between the Palestinian people and Hamas.
And when you say, just in a word, when you say international involvement, do you mean the UN? It's not necessarily easy to see Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, moving in smoothly and easily.
No, there's nothing smooth or easy about this whatsoever. There are so many complex challenges here. But ultimately, the worst case right now for me is a full invasion where it's unclear where this goes, where you leave a vacuum. And then you're going to see, as we saw after 9/11, and this has been called Israel's 9/11, after you saw in 2001, you saw mission creep, you saw huge operational and strategic errors made, perhaps all well-intentioned, but because there wasn't a strategy to lead us into a better place. There wasn't clarity as to what all this was for. And I would hate to see us repeat those same mistakes again in the Middle East. That's why it's so critical. It's very clear where this actually goes to win across the Palestinians. And that will, as I say, involve the international community. But you're right to point out, the UN is turning into the League of Nations. The West is struggling to cope with so many complex threats and conflicts around the world. It's being tested. There's a multitude of challenges, growing challenges, and the West has almost reached this threshold of being able to manage these. All the more important that we hesitate, because I stress how the next few days play out will have huge implications for the next months and years.